Welcome to Little Known Black History Facts. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Public housing, the projects, how the U.S. government segregated America. Public housing is the oldest and until recently largest housing subsidy program in the country. The federal government helped local governments carry out their housing segregation policies or did little to stop them. In 1933, faced with a housing shortage, the federal government began a program explicitly designed to increase and segregate America's housing. The Public Works Administration, created by President Franklin Roosevelt under the New Deal to address the country's housing and infrastructure needs, constructed Techwood Homes in Atlanta, Georgia in 1935 as the first federal public housing project. The project evicted hundreds of black families to build a 604-unit, whites-only neighborhood. While public housing production increased in the post-war period, segregated public housing construction persisted throughout the 60s and 70s and cemented deeply segregated public housing across the country. The housing programs begun under the New Deal were tantamount to a state-sponsored system of segregation. The government's efforts were primarily designed to provide housing to white, middle-class, and lower-middle-class families. African Americans and other people of color were left out of the new suburban communities and pushed instead into urban housing projects. The Federal Housing Administration, which was established in 1934, furthered the segregation efforts by refusing to insure mortgages in and near African American neighborhoods, a policy known as redlining. At the same time, the FHA was subsidizing builders who were mass-producing entire subdivisions for whites, with the requirement that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. These decades-old housing policies have had a lasting effect on American society. Segregation of our metropolitan areas today leads to stagnant inequality because families are much less able to be upwardly mobile when they're living in segregated neighborhoods where opportunity is absent. Public housing began in this country for civilians during the New Deal, and it was an attempt to address a housing shortage. It wasn't a welfare program for poor people. During the Depression, no housing construction was going on. Many middle-class and working-class families were losing their homes during the Depression when they became unemployed. But it was the middle-class and working-class white families that the federal government was most interested in. So the federal government began a program of building public housing for whites only in cities across the country. The liberal instinct of some Roosevelt administration officials led them to build some projects for African Americans as well, but they were always separate projects. They were not integrated. The white projects had large numbers of vacancies. Black projects had long waiting lists. Eventually, it became so conspicuous that the public housing authorities and the federal government opened up the white designated projects and filled them with African Americans. At the same time, industry was leaving the cities. African Americans were becoming poorer in those areas. The projects became projects for poor people, not for working class people. They became subsidized. They hadn't been subsidized before. And so they became vertical slums that we came to associate with public housing. The vacancies in the white projects were created primarily by the Federal Housing Administration program to suburbanize America, and the Federal Housing Administration subsidized mass production builders to create subdivisions that were white only. They subsidized the families who were living in the white housing projects as well as whites who were living elsewhere in the central cities to move them out to these white-only suburbs. So it was the Federal Housing Administration that depopulated public housing of white families, while the public housing authorities were charged with the responsibility of housing African Americans who were increasingly too poor to pay the full cost of their rent. Cities also built projects for low-income African Americans in ghetto neighborhoods, or sometimes in neighborhoods to which planners wanted to relocate a ghetto. Unlike projects for middle-class whites who paid market rents that fully covered construction and operating costs, projects for low-income blacks were heavily subsidized with federal and sometimes state and local funds. Lenders, with the encouragement of the federal government, employed underwriting rules that preferred and sought to maintain racially white neighborhoods, in the practice called redlining. federal agencies financed nearly half of all suburban homes in the 1950s and 1960s, boom years in the creation of middle-class America, boosting home ownership rates nearly 30% of the population to more than 60% by 1960. Of course, black applicants were left out. By one analysis, 98% of the loans approved by the federal government between 1934 and 1968 went to whites. Rather than create a nation of homeowners, the housing programs of the Great Society, which relied on private and public ventures that always almost benefited the private interest, only helped to intensify racial disparity. The original motivation for building this housing was to alleviate poverty, to clear slums, and to provide decent, affordable places to live. Much of the housing was intended for many African American families who had made their way north as part of the Great Migration and were now crowded in tenements that lacked basic facilities, running water, flushing toilets, and reliable heat. But these developments were built in already poor, racially segregated communities. Chicago and Washington, D.C. constructed new highways and train lines that cut residents off from the rest of the city. These modern high-rises quickly became national symbols of the failures of the war on poverty, suffering all the ills of chronic poverty and disadvantage, female-headed households, high rates of unemployment, low levels of education, shocking levels of physical and mental illness, and most of all, overwhelming drug trafficking and violent crime. Many factors contributed to the failures of public housing in the United States. Poor design and construction, coupled with ineffective management, meant that the buildings quickly deteriorated. The large numbers of multi-bedroom units meant that the properties were dominated by big families, creating an unnatural adult-child ratio that contributed to vandalism and disorder. The Department of Housing and Urban Development failed to provide adequate funding for operations, prompting housing authorities to hike tenant rents, driving out those who could afford to do better. As conditions deteriorated, families who could afford better fled, leaving behind a population increasingly dominated by the poorest and most vulnerable families. The transformation of public housing that began in the 1990s led to the demolition of most of the worst housing. New mixed-income developments constructed with today's best design principles have replaced dilapidated properties in many cities. The Section 8 voucher program has offered poorer families the opportunity to find housing in private markets, sometimes even providing assistance with finding housing in areas that should offer greater opportunity, better schools, parks, and access to jobs. While these efforts mean that many residents are now living in better housing, in safer neighborhoods, and have a better quality of life, even the most ambitious efforts have done little to help lift these families out of poverty. The legacy of racial segregation in public housing that still remains means that these families are likely to continue to be left behind. Until next time, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Press the bell to be notified of future uploads. Thank you for watching.